This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to Roots and All. This week's guest is Martyn Richards, who's the Home and Garden Manager for Agriton UK. They're part of a large European group of companies who manufacture products to help commercial and domestic users deal with the soil, crop, animal waste cycle. Martyn contacted me to see if I'd be interested in speaking to him about their Bokashi composting system, and I thought, yes, I would, because I don't really understand the process. So my first question to Martyn was, just what is Bokashi?
So Bokashi itself is the fermentation of organic matter. So it's actually Japanese. The process itself is using a system called anaerobic decomposition. So when you compost, normally you use air to be able to break down the organic matter. This is a fermentation process. It's probably the best way to describe it is if you took a cabbage and you then pickled it. That's what that process is. It's retaining those nutrients, but also increasing the organic matter. So Bokashi compost itself is not actually a compost. And I think sometimes people don't realize that actually the process itself is a fermentation process. So if you put a chicken carcass using food waste into this process, you will get a chicken carcass the other side. So it's not like a composting system where you would get soil out the other side. This is more about a fertilizer than it is about compost itself.
Interesting. Obviously, it's a different product. Is it better than traditional compost, or is it equally good but in a different way?
So I need to break it down a little bit more in respects to traditional composting. So the answer isn't a straight yes or no. It depends what you're going to do with it. So the Bokashi compost itself, we have different variations in it. So first you can do food waste. So you can take the food waste and put it back into your garden. You can take green waste, so very similar to using a composting system. So you can take all your vegetable leftovers, your grass clippings, etc., and be able to put that process through with Bokashi. You can do farmyard manure. So we have quite a big business with farmers to retain the nutrients and retain the nitrogen in farmyard manure. And a very controversial subject, dog poo. So a lot of people ask, what can you do with dog poo? You can actually Bokashi this process as well. And the reason why it's important to bear this in mind, whatever you're doing, as long as it's organic matter, you have the ability to then transfer that into something that can be nutrient rich for the soil. If you think about the garden itself, a lot of people now are talking about natural gardening and no-till. And when I talk to customers about the difference between it, I see natural gardening as a good way of using Bokashi. So you're encouraging the soil to rejuvenate and kind of make itself fresher and a lot more healthy. And no-till, which is a really big buzzword at the moment, is you have to bring in the soil, the compost into the land. So if I was going to kind of say, is it better than traditional composting? I feel that Bokashi is a way of regenerating, especially when we talk about composting generally. It's really important to think about, what do I want out of the system? Do I want to build from the basics, which will take a bit more time, or do I just want to quick instant fix and then bring something into the garden so I can just use it straight away?
So I'm guessing it's more tricky to make, or it takes longer, does it, than traditional compost?
So the process itself is actually quicker than standard composting. So if we take food waste for a starting point, food waste you put into an anaerobic system using the Bokashi bin. So there's two ways of doing that. Either you can buy a system. So we sell Agriton Bokashi buckets, which means you buy a ready-made system. You do need a thing called Bokashi bran. So Bokashi bran itself is the way that we then ferment that food waste. And it's a layering system. So you put a bit of food waste in, and then a bit of bran, literally a handful of bran on top, and you then put everything into that process. The great thing about the food waste is you can put everything in. So normally people will be very wary about bones or carcasses, chicken carcasses, or meat, or dairy, etc. The microorganisms that we use, which are effective microorganisms, will break down any of that organic matter, which means that you can then put anything into it. So the way that I look at it is, if you take your Sunday roast and you're cutting up all your vegetable peels, you can put those in to begin with. And then when you finish your roasting, only the scraps that are left, you can then put into the food waste. But the great thing about Bokashi is that it's not just food waste. And I think, we spend a lot of time talking about food waste, but actually Bokashi itself can be used in the garden as well. So instead of standard composting where you're putting air, water, heat, and your own time into it, you can do that same system with your green waste. It's slightly different. So you don't need to use a bucket. You just need to use a sheet to go over the top. And you're going to use the same kind of layering system, but it's using a standard composting system with carbon and nitrogen ratio. So normally with composting, you're looking at a sort of 30 to 1, so 30 carbon to 1 nitrogen ratio. If anyone is interested, on the Agriton website, there is a compost calculator, which is super useful. So if you've got loads of different variations of stuff that you want to put into your green waste, it will work out a ratio for you. And then you use a product called Actifern, which is our effective microorganisms, and a gear, which is seashell grit. Again, it's a lasagna kind of system. So you're layering it up and then you then cover it up. So the food waste normally take 2 weeks to be ready to be used in the soil. The green waste, you're looking at between 8 and 12 weeks, depending on how small you make those bits. So both those processes in respects to a normal composting system is a lot quicker.
Am I right in thinking it needs to get up to a particular temperature then in order to work?
So this is a great thing with Bokashi, because you're fermenting, you're not relying on heat for that process. So especially in the UK, although the weather's been very good for us the last couple of months, we do have a winter time where compost is very, very difficult to do. So the green waste and food waste is using a fermentation process. So the microbes themselves are based on a no heat system, which means you can run it 365 days of the year. So especially if you're doing green waste, it's a good alternative to composting.
If you had like a large garden or a large site, would it be cost effective to do this at scale? I'm thinking, if you've got a very large compost bin or maybe 3 on the go at once, a big garden can generate a lot of waste. Is there a lot of kind of work involved in it and a lot of cost in terms of applying the additional things like the Bokashi bran? Is it practical at large scale?
Yeah, and again, this is probably for a lot of people, this is something new. So as a company, all we've done is we've taken what's already happening in nature, and we've taken lactic acid bacteria, phototrophic bacteria, and yeast, and done a blend of 80 microorganisms to make a product that's easy to use. But as a company, we're part of a group called MRO. So the actual system itself was designed by a guy called Dr. Higa. To be a certified EM distributor, we have to follow the kind of standards that he sets. And it's not like those rules and regulations are there to control us. It's more to make sure that system works. And the reason why this is important is that, especially for the green waste, we will give anyone the tools to even brew their own Actifern. So if you take the process of the actual product itself, EM1, which is our kind of our mother product, we sell that as a dormant product. So if you wanted to make Actifern, which is the product we were talking about with the green waste, a customer can take the EM1, take sugarcane molasses and brew it just like you would brew beer with a heater, and it can work out at as little as 10p a litre. The thing is that some customers want a pre-made system, so that's why we created a product called Actifern. So the Actifern is off-the-shelf product, but to put it into context, to do a ton's worth of Bokashi in green waste, you're looking at 2 litres, which is roughly about £10. But that product is a nutrient-rich product. So I think, especially if you are looking at a large scale, you need to think about what you want out of it. The big thing with composting is people are sometimes very hung up on, I've got 100 tons, I want to make it as small as possible. And the problem is with using aeration as a system is you lose the nutrients, you lose the value, the energy in that product. So Bokashi as a system, if you take 100 tons, you're actually going to get about 90 tons back. When you lift the sheet off on the green waste, it still looks like everything you've put in. But we call it that pre-digested food for the soil. So especially with the droughts that we've had recently in the UK, the problem is the soil that we have at the moment is not being able to take up the nutrients and take up the carbon that's available. And the great thing with using the Bokashi system is you keep that carbon in the soil, and it doesn't then go as CO2 or greenhouse gases into the air. I think the key thing is that you need to kind of think about what you want from your output. If you've got lots of organic matter that you just want to make smaller, then yeah, there's definitely a place for aerobic systems. But if you want to think about it as a value for money in respect to nutrients and not having to bring other things into your garden, then it's definitely a cheap alternative.
So the end product is, as you say, not much reduced in mass. Did you say it kind of resembles a little bit what you've put in?
Yeah. And we do get a lot of customers who will talk to us and go, well, actually, I don't think it's worked. I don't think it doesn't look like soil. So if you think about it from a system, what we're trying to do, we're trying to retain all the nutrients. We literally are pickling that process. So the food waste and the green waste will look identical to what you put in. The thing is that you have a choice then of what you want to do with it. So, for example, food waste, the best way to kind of process it is actually to dig a trench in your garden and let the soil food web do the work. Worms love the system because it's got a low pH and it's pre-digested. I think, people forget that worms don't have teeth. So actually, if you think about the process, there's a lot of effort that goes involved to try and break down any kind of organic matter for wormeries, etc. And just to make you aware, if you want to use food waste in a wormery, again, worms would love that as a process. The green waste is exactly the same process. If you put a leak into that process, after 8 to 12 weeks, it will still look like a leak. But when you then start to crush it with your hand, you'll see that the ligament, the actual structure of the leak, will start to be manipulated very easily. Both these systems, if you put that organic matter back into the soil food web will do what it needs to do. But you can then add it to an aerobic system. So let's just say that you've got a compost pile that you've been nurturing for a long period of time with water, with heat, and you're regularly turning it to try and get the best out of it. If you want to accelerate that, the microorganisms we use are what we call facultative. So they actually work in an anaerobic and an aerobic system. So if you want to then accelerate that process, you could actually put that food waste or that green waste into your aerobic system and accelerate that process. Now, the only thing I would say to anyone that's going to do that is you're decreasing what the value of that Bokashi is. So actually, if you think about it as a process, the reason why you want to do it is to keep that organic matter. But if you have an issue with a large amount that you're trying to process, you could put it into an aerobic system to decrease the amount of physical organic matter you have.
So I'm guessing when you've got your end product, although it looks like food that went in, it's not going to be attractive to things like rats or foxes, for example.
The things with animals will always have a sniff around. We recommend 12 inches deep when it comes to digging a trench. I mean, I can only go on personal experience and obviously customer feedback that we've had. As long as it's below that sort of 12 inches, then animals won't be interested. The key thing to take away from Bokashi as a process, pH is quite an important part of composting. So actually the process, because it uses lactic acid bacteria, is around a 3.5, 3.8 area, i.e. if you were an animal and you did taste it, it wouldn't be very nice to taste. But actually, as a product, it's really good for the soil food web because it's a very easily pre-digest product. Normal composting, you're looking at sort of a pH of 8. So let's just say hypothetically you did put food waste into an aerated system, which, there are other systems available, like the Jura system, where you can actually add carbon and you can add food waste to it and you can then rotate it. That is still food waste. And because you're not adding those microbes to then decrease the pH, then unfortunately we'll create an activity of rats and vermin, etc. So no, you won't get any issues with that.
So you mentioned no-till, also known as no-dig, and that does require a big input in terms of organic material, but it's usually laid on top of the soil. So you could presumably put your layer of Bokashi on and then maybe top dress that with something like wood chip. If you were to do that, what happens when it goes into the soil in terms of soil enrichment or feeding micro and macro organisms that are already in the soil?
We get a lot of market gardeners coming to us because of the microorganism and live in the soil. And I was actually talking to a market gardener in North Wales this week. He said to me that he had some compost coming in and he wanted to make it living. Now, in respects to what I would personally do in that scenario, I would still, the composting still has a value because, the thing is with ground, there are a lot of differences in parts of the UK in respects to kind of nutritional value, especially for this example, this was pasture land. It'd been used within an inch of its life in respects to soil health. So they wanted to build that infrastructure back with microorganisms. So what we recommended for them was actually to be used for grass they already have and do a cut and drop system. So instead of just putting the cardboard down and then the compost on top, what we've recommended that they do is that they cut the grass down, they put active ferment in gear to make a Bokashi process, cover it with a piece of plastic, and then when they're ready to start planting, they would then lift that cardboard up, put the cardboard on top, then put the compost on top, and then that gives the ground the opportunity to have some nutrient-rich, dense material underneath for the soil food web, which then can incorporate with the compost. I think composting that's available at the moment, and there are some local-based compost providers who are really looking at the sort of living soil and kind of expanding more into that to get good yield and good quality out of your vegetables, etc. You do need to have that micro kind of activity. And one of the things that people say to me when they use effective microorganisms in Bokashi, etc., is that a carrot tastes more like a carrot. And I laugh when people say that to me because I'm so used to it because I do it on a yearly basis. But I can see what they're saying. If you go to a supermarket and you taste a carrot, yes, it looks like a carrot. There is some taste to the carrot. And obviously, if you buy an organic carrot, you will get some more taste. But if you grow something yourself, that taste is nothing more to do than the microorganisms actually giving the nutrients to that plant. And that's really important when it comes to no-till, that they have the opportunity to be able to do that.
And do you notice that plants are healthier when they're grown with it then as well?
Yeah, the problem that we have with the kind of the standard gardening that we're used to is that we have an issue and then we deal with it. We don't really think about it as a proactive system, and nature's always worked on its own system. I mean, I use an example of a wooded environment. You don't see composting happen in the wooded environment. So when the leaves shed their leaves, they create a small amount of surface area, but they actually create a very small anaerobic system in that process. But what they're doing is over time with nature, the trees and the biodiversity has learned to kind of work as one. When we take a garden environment, unfortunately, we're expecting yields all year round. We don't think about how that soil is going to rejuvenate itself. And one of the big things, you look at allotments and they're pristine and beautiful soil, but they have no structure to it. They don't keep water in, they don't keep the nutrients in. And the poor microbes, or look at it from our point of view, at this time of year when it's getting colder, we want to put more clothes on. Microbes don't need heat, but they do need some comfort. And without anything on the top of it, then you can have issues. Now, if we then take a look at disease and issues with plant health, it's the same as us. If we don't have a balance in our diet, we struggle as well. And when we're looking at soil and growing any plant, if we can get the soil right, so we get the basics right in respect to micro biomes and diversity, it will naturally create its own plant defenses. Now, sometimes, like we do, we need a bit of help in hand. And that's where the Bokashi process is something that we've learned, and we had research to show that actually it can create its own biodiversity, which means that it will then suppress any diseases. So being more proactive than reactive.
And you mentioned obviously putting things in like dog waste. Is there anything you can't put in there?
Yeah, just to emphasize with dog waste. So dog waste is a very nitrogen rich product. I would personally if you are going to do it, you need to do it as a separate bucket. In respects to kind of what you can't put into it, you can put everything into it, but if it's a highly dense product, so let's just say it was a lamb bone in food waste, that will take a lot of time to break down. So we recommend to kind of cut things up as best you can to sort of 5 centimeters. If you can't do that, then all you need is more time. So more water and more time. So for example, with the green waste, you need a sort of 40 to 60% moisture content. The food waste has its own moisture content in it anyway. And for dog poo, because it's nitrogen orientated, you just need to add more carbon to it. But yeah, you can put anything into this process.
And how long would you be looking at on average for it to churn out the finished product?
So food waste, you're looking at 2 weeks from you filling the bucket up, leaving it for 2 weeks. We always sell them in 2 buckets, although you can buy 1 bucket. I don't personally see I think they're quite pointless just having 1, because you need to leave 1 for 2 weeks while you're filling the other one up. So that will take 2 weeks to process and then be able to be used. Green waste, you're looking between 8 and 12 weeks to have a product that you can use. And things like dog poo, etc. Yeah, again, the same, sort of 8 to 12 weeks.
And also, does it matter kind of what you put in versus what comes out? Will the nutrient value differ depending on what you put into the beginning?
Good question. Yes, is the answer. But in respects to the health of the soil, you're keeping up carbon in that process. So to put it into context, I said that composting is a 30-to-1. Bokashi, the sweet spot is 20 carbon to nitrogen ratio. So if you put more carbon into that process, it's not that it won't do the process, but it will have to take more time to be able to break itself down. I think, when you're looking at, again, every garden is going to be different. Every input's going to be different in respects to what you put in. My suggestion would be to jump onto our compost calculator on our website on Agriton Direct, and actually have a little play around and see where you can add and release stuff. We've talked about food waste, we talked about green waste, but you can add all those things together. So you could do a mix of farmyard manure, wormery based soil, food, and green waste, and we call it a Bokashi reactor. I'm going to name Josh Sparks, who is a guy on Instagram. He kind of came up with this concept, and he's actually processing food waste for the whole village in his project in Worsley in North Devon. And he wants to provide soil more than just something that doesn't look like soils, but he can use in his natural gardening. So actually he then just adds literally everything he has on his farm, but he does process slightly different. So it's still a layering system, but he actually then puts a little bit of oxygen, very similar to a Johnson Sioux system. And that does take a little bit longer. That takes about 3 months. But the content, if you want to check him out on Instagram, the content of what he gets out the outside is remarkable. It's very rich in NPK, very rich in diversity. And if you have a look at his Instagram stories, the vegetables he's getting out this year are amazing.
Yeah, so obviously Joshua is a really good resource, as is your website, which you've mentioned, and I will put a link to it in the show notes. Are there any other resources that you'd like to recommend? And I'm thinking books or websites, anything like that.
So I was going to make a recommendation. So we use a process called effective microorganisms, EM. Actually, the concept is nothing new. It's something that happens in nature. But if you are interested, 2 books I'd highly recommend would be An Earth Saving Revolution, which was written by Dr. Hiko, who designed the concept of EM. And he also has a second part to the books as well. Those books really give us an ability to kind of understand the reasoning behind EM. As a company, we've taken the step that all we want to do is utilize nature as best we can. And sometimes we have to mechanically do that, i.e. we have to bring some bits to nature together. And, one of our philosophy is the same as Dr. Heaper, is that if we can create the same outputs with nature, then that's great. If we can add more to it, so more diversity to it, then that will obviously create a better impact. Also, I'd like to say there is a lot of resources out there with composting networks. So I would always suggest have a look at your local composting systems. There are many systems. The two that I work with are Old Tree Soil, and they have their own, we call it a mycelium compost network. So if you want to learn more about composting generally, it's a super resource. They have got loads of information on all types of composting. I would highly recommend Tom there. The other one would be Soil Club. So Soil Club are based in Brighton. Again, they are really good at kind of bringing everything together. And, you know, one of the things I feel for the future is to try and think about local. You know, there's all very well having all these systems. So the Compost Club in Brighton, they've got a really good project going on, same as Old Tree Soil. And actually, they're sharing their resources locally. And, you know, that's really important to move forward.
Thanks to you for listening, and thank you very much to Martyn for taking the time to try and explain Bokashi to me. I still have lots of questions about the process, so if anyone would like to come on the podcast and try and add to my knowledge of the alchemical process that is composting, do get in touch. What I would say is that after doing lots of research into composting and doing lots of it in practice too, is that eventually whatever you leave to compost down will turn into organic matter that you can use in the garden. If you have time to experiment and lavish that time and money on your heap, then more power to you. If you don't want to water your heap or feed it with purchased products or turn it because you like the fact that it's home to wildlife, if you don't want to worry about your ratio of greens to browns, and you don't mind if it takes a while to brook down, I can assure you that your pile will eventually become lovely black humus that you can put on your garden. I'm not a fan of overthinking or overcomplicating things, but what I am a fan of is keeping waste in your own garden and not depleting the organic matter that already exists within your system. If you can spare some space, bung any of your waste into a pile or stick it in an old compost bag, chuck it behind a wall, leave it behind the hedge, and as long as it's not really large pieces of woody material, when you go back to it in a year or two, it will be nicely decomposed, I promise you, and the wildlife will love it too. And if it's not, I'll refund you the purchase price of this episode. Dr. Ian Bedford is up next, talking about yet another rascal that wants to ruin your cabbages.
Brassica is a genus of plants from the mustard family that we'll often refer to as our cruciferous veg and cabbage crops. A key feature of Brassica is their ability to metabolize biologically active compounds called glucosinolates. Glucosinolates, or mustard oils as they're also known, are high in nitrogen and sulfur and have become a component of the brassica's natural defense system, where they effectively regulate the feeding of warm-blooded herbivores, providing health benefits when eaten in moderation, but harming their digestive system when consumed in excess. But these glucosinolates also function as a powerful biopesticide that protects the brassica from many plant-feeding insects and microbial diseases. However, it's often the case that when a plant's defense system is effective against generalist herbivores, it also enables others to adapt and become specialist feeders of the plant. And this has certainly been the case with brassicas, where some species of insects have become troublesome crop pests that thrive on glucosinolates. And one of these is called the cabbage whitefly, Aleorodes prolatella. Adult cabbage whitefly look like tiny white moths. However, they're actually a sap-sucking insect that's related to aphids. Attracted to many different types of brassica, these whitefly congregate on the undersides of young leaves, where they pair and mate before laying clusters of eggs in circles. After a few days, the eggs split open to reveal a tiny nymph that pushes its needle-like mouthpart into the leaf and begins feeding on the sap. As it grows, the nymph sheds its skin, and in doing so, loses its legs. Unable to move, it remains attached to the leaf, whilst plant sap continually flows into its body. And whilst nutrients are absorbed through its gut, the waste is excreted as honeydew. But to avoid drowning in this sticky liquid, the nymph flicks it away using a spoon-like appendage at the end of its body, where the honeydew often contaminates the lower leaves, causing black, sooty moulds to grow. Eventually, though, after 3 or 4 weeks, the nymphs stop feeding, and their skins harden to form a shell, which later splits open to reveal the next generation of cabbage whitefly. Effectively controlling an infestation of these whitefly won't be easy, since numerous eggs will be laid on the younger leaves by adults that rapidly disperse when disturbed. However, regular applications of a non-toxic soap-based spray and removal of any old leaves where the immobile nymphs might be present could certainly help in reducing the infestation.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.